digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by Sarah from Coventry University. We have with us Nick from Bolton University. We have also Ben from Curiscope and Kim, who is a freelance director. Hello guys and welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hello.
So I'm going to ask really briefly if you could explain a little bit more about what you do. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah, because you've been on the show before. If you could just remind our lovely listeners exactly what you do over at Coventry University, that would be amazing.
Okay, hi, I am Sarah Jones, the virtual Sarah J, and I kind of situate myself within immersive realities, looking at VR and AR, predominantly from a storytelling point of view, how we tell stories within this space, but more how we can use those stories for teaching and learning. So developing scenarios, whether they be for forensics, for paramedics, for emergency nursing, resuscitation, but also more media-friendly subjects as well, and journalism, for example, which has been really interesting to kind of develop different tools based on storytelling, based on film, based on narratives, but putting those within an educational context as well. So we can start using them as an addition to how students particularly are taught and how they learn from using immersive technologies.
Wonderful, thank you. And Nick, why don't you explain to us what you're doing over at Bolton?
So I'm the academic deputy head at Bolton School Boys Division. We're a school, not a university.
My bad.
That's okay, don't worry. I was slightly elevated there, I suppose. So I'm in charge of teaching and learning in the school, and one of my main foci is looking at use of technology in the classroom and how we can use the one-to-one iPads we have in the school to impact on learning, really, I suppose.
Okay, wonderful. Ben, why don't you tell us all about what you're doing over at Curiscope?
Hi, yeah, so my name's Ben Kidd, and as you rightly introduced me, we are Curiscope, and we focus on inspiring using AR and VR. And what that takes shape in is that we can take young minds and, well, any age of mind really, on wonderful adventures where they couldn't normally do without AR and VR technology. So what that essentially allows people to do is, say, go to ancient Egypt and actually, while they're there, perhaps learn about maths instead. So you can kind of inspire people to feel passionate about subjects that are not necessarily so familiar with in the form of adventures.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Kim, why don't you tell us about some of the work that you're doing? I know that you're a freelance director, but there are some other interesting programs that you have helped to get off the ground, and we'd love to hear more about that.
Yes, so my name's Kim Mykit, and as you said, I work mainly as a director, but with the joy of VR, like most people, they start working in it and they get sucked into it because it's exciting. I focused mainly recently a lot on educational practices for it because my background is kids entertainment, and I enjoyed mainly creating content that inspired and educated kids. And now I find with the tool of VR, it unlocks this potential. So I've been working with companies like Curiscope to help create amazing content. Also teamed up with Sarah Jones to create VR and education on Facebook. So it's really trying to make a community and to understand what people need or people want and how the educational sector is working with VR at the moment.
Okay, so there's two interesting areas of conversation here, and the first one I think that really needs to be kind of discussed more frequently within our industry is understanding what the long-term impact is of education and the application of VR technologies and AR technologies in education. And I say this on the basis of, not that long ago, people thought it was kind of a bad thing to give kids, mobile phones or tablet devices. And the fact that young children under the age of 18 months were learning how to swipe first rather than actually be able to, pick something up and clutch it. I think there are a lot of people who have concerns about the impact of technology and where that sits in the educational process. And I know that one of the areas that we haven't really looked into in as much depth as we should, and there are some studies that are beginning to be initiated around this, is also the social long-term impact and the psychological long-term impact of utilising VR. And when we're dealing with such young minds, I'm interested from your perspective, Nick, being that you're in the classroom and you're practically seeing the application of tablet technology, whether or not there are any primary concerns in using immersive technologies, whether that is VR or AR, with children of a reasonably young age, as to whether or not there are any psychological potential impacts that you've been looking at or thinking about.
So I suppose one of the things is that with the very young students, it is quite a hard thing to to put them into a virtual reality because they lose all sense of bearing, and as well as the issues around nausea and motion sickness that they can get. It's sometimes hard for them to actually fully grasp what is actually going on, and because of that, we've tended not to do so much immersive stuff with the really young students, and we tend to start looking at that with secondary age students.
Okay, and from your perspective, Sarah, when you're doing things at the university, is there any specific thought that's going into the long-term impact? I know, for example, with the creation of content, let's talk about horror, for example, there aren't a huge amount of people who are thinking first before making that content. They just want to make, they want to make scary stuff, and they want to make people jump and scream and, be terrified. And that's all well and good, but we're kind of forgetting that when we create these immersive environments, these immersive experiences, when we create a horror experience, we are literally traumatizing our audience. And we're doing it for the benefit of traumatizing our audience rather than doing something that's necessarily meaningful. And that there isn't really a way to escape from that. In the real world, when we're watching a horror movie, we close our eyes, we turn the TV off, we turn away from it. We can do that. In an immersive environment, sure, you can close your eyes, but you can still feel that you're fully immersed. You can hear it around you. And because of that, there is that sense of perhaps it is slightly less healthy for people to be immersed in these types of environments that aren't really being questioned at the moment. There's nobody who's necessarily, out there putting an age stamp on these things and certifying these things, because the certification processes are so entirely different for other forms of media. But nobody's really got round to that just yet in VR, though there are many people who are working on it. It's not something that's out there in the world right now. And there are a lot of people who are creating content and putting that content out there in the world. And I'm curious, because you're dealing with a slightly more mature audience, whether or not that's something that is given consideration when you're talking about developing experiences.
I think there's a few things to kind of think about there, and there is a responsibility, and I know we've covered it before in another Digital Jam sessions, about that responsibility for the content creators to be really aware of what they're doing. And horror is great in VR. I really do like it, and I do scream, and I do get and it's great, but you don't really want that in an educational setting. And I'm always really interested in the brain hacking idea of how you can really change people's minds in VR. But again, that can be really dangerous as well. And I think really when you're looking at immersive technologies as a tool for education, you're looking at what's going to be enhancing their learning. What, as Ben said, can you inspire people? How can you inspire them, and how can you add to their learning experience? And for me, when I'm working with different disciplines, and I work across a lot of different areas in creating virtual experiences, it's always the main starting point is always, what experience do we need students to have that they're not currently getting? What's missing from that experience? Because VR is about an experience. So for example, when I was working on this paramedic scenario, we had students that had never seen anyone choking in front of them, and they were faced with this scenario where they could be the paramedic in that environment. They could see someone choking and they would have to make decisions about it. So it made them have that experience. They would feel more confident when they then went into a practical workplace setting. So when you take it from that standpoint, you're looking at enhancing the teaching and learning, but certainly there is a responsibility on the content creators, and there's a responsibility when you're testing it. You've got to go through general health and safety. You've got to make sure people know if they feel uncomfortable, they have to take a headset off. All those kinds of things need to be addressed. It's not a case of simply anyone just getting a a Google Cardboard and sticking it on and leaving the class. It's still got to be that shared experience. It's still got to have the teaching. It's still got to have the learning. But this is a way that you can inspire and you can create an experience that they can really learn from.
Okay, you mentioned something there which I think is quite interesting. I'm curious to hear from you, Ben, about this, which is the idea of shared experiences in the classroom is kind of fundamental to part of the whole classroom experience. You know, you're in that room with many other students and there are dynamics within that classroom. There is benefits to being in a room with other people, but just purely by the nature of what VR in HMD form is, means that it's very isolating, it's a very insular experience. And I'm curious, Ben, from your perspective, how you maintain that idea of social inclusion, that idea of that dynamic within the classroom, within a VR teaching environment.
Sure. Well, I think HMD being kind of the key word there, really, because that becomes an anchor point to how we're actually discussing VR. Because actually, I'd like to see a future where VR isn't actually anything on you. It could actually be projected into your environment, or it could actually be, you know, in a very sci-fi way of looking at it, being projected into your imagination directly. And in those circumstances, we haven't got a hardware limitation that blocks our faces from each other. But even if we do have that, there's software solutions to it involving avatars, and there are headsets which are tracking your eyes and tracking your facial features. And actually, my experiences with social VR so far, for example, with AltSpace VR, is that I very quickly adjusted to recognizing somebody's avatar. And my brain was reading the avatar's body language. And it was a new language because it wasn't a human avatar. It was like a robot. And I was amazed at how quickly it became a very sociable experience again, and we connected. And I think that as the technology moves on, we will, you know, social is going to be a huge part of VR, not just because of education's requirement for it, but for societies. You know, this, as a species, we require social interaction. Maybe not everyone, but most people.
Okay.
And so, you know, I think that's what's going to help fuel it in education. As it stands at the moment, it's actually very social in a classroom as it currently stands, because what we've noticed with our experiences when we demo it in class or we demo it in groups with people, is they're really sharing it inside and outside the headset. And actually it's creating discussion points in the classroom beyond the actual experience. So there's that to consider as well.
But how long do you think that will really last, bearing in mind that a lot of that discussion is really because it's a new gadget, it's a new thing that a lot of them haven't experienced, and over time that balance will shift to, you know, it's another normal gadget that everybody's kind of seen, and so that conversation will reduce in that sense.
Well, yes, I mean, I can see that there's definitely a novelty effect to VR, and I think VR's been riding on that for a while. I think I've been looking forward to seeing that rub away and wear off, because that's what's going to really open up VR. At the moment, that novelty is hurting it, because I can put any content in the headset, anything, and it will wow someone who's never seen VR before. That's quite dangerous, because actually what we need, just like television, we don't stand around and discuss television anymore. We discuss content. And that's why I think we need to go with VR as well. Although headsets will always improve, the technology will always improve, in our normal world of television and other computers, devices, they're separate from the content. Is a very separate conversation from the hardware. And when VR gets to that point, and it should be pretty quickly, they will still be talking about the experiences they've had in VR outside of VR, in the same way that we discuss popular TV shows on Monday after we haven't seen each other for a couple of days.
So we're looking for the next Westworld or the next Game of Thrones in VR.
Yeah, let's blow people's minds, not with the technology, but with our ideas and what we can do with the technology.
Absolutely. Kim, I'm curious to hear from you on this. As a director who's looking at the content creation side of things, you know, obviously what Ben's saying is kind of really relevant right now, in as much as the majority of the content that we're seeing that's being put out there, irrespective of whether that is entertainment content or educationary content, we're seeing very shallow experiences out there. We're seeing stuff that's maybe, you know, 8 to 12 minutes long. It's not exactly in-depth content, and it's not necessarily, you know, informative or narratively driven in many, many cases. And I'm curious from your perspective, what you see as the primary challenges in shifting the paradigm and the approach to this content creation to be more meaningful and more impactful.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I've had this conversation a lot with a lot of people recently. And the first thing I always say is that when you're making stuff for VR, people are just making it. They forget that VR is a medium unto its own. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of interacting with someone. It's a different way the person views a topic or the content itself. So I find a lot of stuff that I see at the moment, I'm very wary to say that I love something at the moment when I see a lot of content, because not much of it wows me, because a lot of it is just repurposed. Like you even see it with games. Games are being created that have been played for the past 10 years, and they're just taking that game and just throwing it in a VR environment. And then it's like, well, it's the game, but it doesn't really quite work, or it doesn't captivate you. And the same as you see when you see 360 video or someone who's trying to do a documentary, they're filming it in the same way that they would take a camera on set. They would bring it on as if you're creating a narrative of someone being immersed in the environment. And it's a tricky one. And I find it's fascinating to see how people are learning, because that's exactly what it is. We're all learning from each other.
Absolutely.
Like every time we pick up the medium, we're just going, okay, I learned this from it. We're not going to do this again. I'm not going to do that again. Let's go try this next time. But I think right now we're still babies. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think we are in that exploratory phase of the medium and what it's capable of. But one thing I do find and see an awful lot of is people bringing their existing industry, their existing bad habits to a new medium. And, one of the previous VR writers that we've had on the show, he commented about when he receives scripts for VR content, and it starts with the opening of "we cut to" or "we open on," and it's like you don't really get how this works, because you can't really frame it for them. And so I think that there is this kind of, it's almost like the ghost limb syndrome that we have when we're bringing our expectations from our existing industries into what is essentially a new format and a new medium, as you rightly said. But I am curious from an educational perspective, because one of the things that we're hearing an awful lot about at the moment is this idea of learned helplessness and dependency on technology. And I say this on the basis of, of all of us on this phone call right now, I feel reasonably confident that you all have a smartphone in your pocket or somewhere very close to your person. And if I was to say to each of you, you know what, just hand over your smartphone and unlock it, leave it with us, and we're just going to let a few people rummage on that and do what they please, and you're not going to see your phone for at least 7 days, most of you would start feeling slightly anxious. Please tell me if not, because we've become...
one of my demo phones that I take to events, and that's precisely what I do with it. I just
if it was your personal phone,
just hope we get it back.
If it was your...
Very brave.
Yeah, and there's a reason why we wouldn't do that with our personal phone, is because we have applied an emotional attachment to a physical device. That mobile phone has an emotional attachment for us because it contains all of our personal information, our personal thoughts, our feelings, our relationships. They're all held on this physical device. And so we've become very, very dependent on our mobile phones. And most people now, if you say, you know what, I'm lost, I need to get from point A to point B, they're just going to crack out their mobile phone and look on Google Maps. The idea of physically reading a map, an old-fashioned map, or asking for directions in the old-fashioned way, is not really one that the younger generation kind of immediately go to. That's not their first port of call. Their first port of call is going to be to crack out the technology that they're used to and try to use that to figure out their problem. And so in some ways, what we're seeing now is the emergence of this new type of technology in terms of VR and AR, where we're talking about replacing people's perception or understanding of what normal is or where acceptable boundaries lie. And I think, Sarah, I was at an event with you where somebody mentioned this, where there was a play that somebody had written where it talked about the use of VR as a tool for essentially the VR environment was some kind of house of the night, shall we call it, and that people were having, sexual encounters with each other in this environment. But it turned out that actually within this environment, the men who were going in thought that they were having sexual encounters with underage children. But in reality, they were actually having sexual encounters with other people who thought they were having sexual encounters with underage children, because actually everybody was being played by essentially people who were equally as distant as they were in their perception of what was normal and what was okay. But the questions that play kind of thrust into people's kind of consciousness was this idea of, is it right to give people that skewed sense of reality that allows them to play out their fantasies and to play out the things that, whether it's being more violent, whether it's being sexual, whether it's being whatever the thing may be, allowing them to experience that and normalize that in their life, so that when they are out in the real world, they may perhaps lose their sense of reality and understanding where those boundaries actually lie. And I'm curious what your take on something like that, Sarah.
I don't think I remember that conversation, because I think I would. Yeah, it is a difficult one. It's a difficult one because I do fundamentally like the idea of being able to use technology to change people's minds and learning from that. So all of the Mel Slater work on embodiment and getting people to understand different races and genders and people with disabilities, and understanding how other people live and go about day-to-day lives, I think is really, really important. But then you can fundamentally change people's perceptions and have some really, and there have been some instances of some really difficult situations that have happened in VR. There was one at the back end of last year where someone felt that they were sexually assaulted or physically assaulted within a virtual space, and it was a female player in a world, and some avatars came up, and it was a really awful, it was on Medium, it was a really traumatic piece to read. And I think that there does need to, it goes back to the whole monitoring of the industry, doesn't it, really, and all those conversations that we've had about how you do act and behave, but how things can be manipulated and changed. Yeah, I'm not sure, really.
Do you have any thoughts on this one, Nick?
I think there's I think this is all down to education. But a large part of my role is actually teaching young people how they should behave in an online space, and with the emergence of virtual realities, that's going to pose a new educational challenge of how you teach people to behave in these new worlds, in these new realities that they're going to be experiencing. Because I've also read that article on Medium, and it's terrible that people think that is in any way an acceptable way to behave, and that their inability to apply normal boundaries in a virtual world is something which is it's just a concern, I suppose, and something that as educationists we need to tackle and think about.
And I suppose the question is whether or not we feel that putting some kind of normalization or standards out there that just kind of identify what those basic etiquette rules are. We understand what those etiquette rules are in gaming and in in the cinema, for example. You know that you shouldn't be on your phone and you should keep quiet, and all these other things. And likewise in gaming, you understand the basic principles. Sure, not everybody adheres to those principles, but you do at least understand the difference between right and wrong within the game environment. And I'm curious whether we think that perhaps that's something that needs to be considered earlier rather than later, is the idea of that normalization of some kind of etiquette standard within these social VR environments before it does become something that, the horse is already out of the gate and it's a little bit too late to try and put a rein on it.
Yeah, one of the issues with the emergence of technologies is that a lot of the people that you look to do that education, parents, teachers, whoever that may be, the adults, the grown-ups, I suppose, are behind the children in the first place. So teaching that etiquette becomes a harder thing, because the people that you would naturally expect to do that aren't necessarily familiar or comfortable in that environment themselves. And that's something that I've worked very hard at doing in terms of other aspects of e-safety and sexting and cyberbullying and various other things as well. It's actually trying to educate parents that actually this is the world that they're going into, and you need to be aware of these are the things that you need to talk to your children about.
It's interesting that you say this because we recently had another session where we talked about the evangelization of VR and the kind of mainstream education of what VR is. And I'm curious to hear from you, Ben, on this one, because one of the issues that we have fundamentally as an industry is that there isn't enough education happening. And that's as simple as just explaining to people what VR is and what the difference between, say, for example, tethered VR versus mobile VR versus AR is. And there's a lot of people who are outside of our bubble, because we're very much in an industry bubble. When we talk about this technology, there's actually a very small percentage of the population who necessarily understand the fine detail of what it is that we're actually referring to. But oftentimes we go into these conversations with very broad assumptions that people at least understand the basics as we would define them. And I'm curious, but from your perspective, how you see that being an issue, or what you see being the easiest way to mitigate that kind of issue.
Yeah, I think that is a huge issue. New technology always suffers it, actually. I imagine the idea of walking into a cinema one day was probably something that was kind of alien. How do we do it? Like, what's the rules? Same with the internet. We're seeing some of the best and some of the worst of humanity with technology, because it's allowing us as a species to do things we've never been able to do before that our instincts are telling us to do. And so the way we bring people in and the expectations that we set for this new technology is important. I think you're absolutely right. And then just from a slightly softer point of view, I think it's important to set people's expectations as well. Advertising and marketing has got the tendency to promise the moon on a stick. And even if I render you a beautiful moon on a stick and put it inside a mobile VR device, there's a certain amount of your expectation that if you've oversold it, is actually going to leave you disappointed potentially. I think that's dangerous. Dangerous for the industry. But yeah, I think going to the point about, etiquette and how that plays into, how we bring people in, how we set expectations. I think all of us are new to this, and we all have a responsibility, just like any group of people has a responsibility to set the rules. And I think it's going to be down to the content creators primarily to set the tone. They've got the control, more than anything. And where there are issues arising, and particularly how social media platforms now basically, I imagine they've got huge departments just looking out for errors and quirks in human behavior that need addressing, like the kind of, the whole vote about having a hate button. Why can't we have a hate button?
Yeah.
I think it's going to be down to the custodians of the technology to not police it. I think that's completely the wrong way to look at it. We should not really be telling anyone what to do, but it's going to grow organically, but collectively, democratically, we will need to guide it.
Provide a basic infrastructure, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what humans should always have and will have always have done. That's why we have a knife, fork and a spoon in a certain order in Western culture. I always actually do mine the other way around to be awkward, but we have all these etiquettes that we've all lived with for a long time. And I think when we throw technology in the mix, we suddenly get a bit awkward, like, what's the rules? But actually, as a species, we're quite good at teaching each other. And I think that's really exciting.
But talking about these behaviours and these rules and kind of teaching each other, it does bring me to this kind of interesting point. And I don't know if any of you are aware of Professor Jane McGonigal's work and some of the studies that she's done. But we've referred to this previously in the show, and I'm going to kind of bring it up again, which is this idea, this notion that when children play games, they are fundamentally, they're learning something. And her basic principle was that if children are based into formal education between the ages of 6 to 16, they're learning enough to fundamentally make them useful to society. At the end of that process, they can go out there and get a job and interact with other human beings. And that's the wonders of the work that people like Nick and Sarah are doing. But if during that period of their life, they are spending an equal, if not larger amount of their time also playing games, what therefore are games teaching them? And there was some research and some study that was done around this with the MIT Play Labs. And one of the things that they were talking about is this idea that we're creating a generation of problem solvers. You know, these young people who understand how to identify people's qualities and values and to be able to create the right team setting, to understand the dynamics of those teams and how to adjust them, and to understand the concept of the epic fail. Because these kids are going on quests all the time. So they understand that they need a different combination of people to be able to achieve the mission, and they understand how to work together to be able to accomplish those missions. And they understand the idea of replaying those missions to improve performance. And I'm curious, therefore, to understand whether or not we think that collectively there is perhaps an advantage and a value for young people, or for not necessarily young people, but for people with that inherent experience of gaming and that inherent experience of the collaborative culture of gaming and of, I'm going to say geek and nerd, and I say this with love and affection because I count myself as one. But that idea that those kind of communities will have an advantage in these types of technological environments in a way that, as you mentioned previously, Nick, you know, parents and the people who would traditionally, give a guidance and advice in these types of scenarios, they simply are not aware. They're simply not in these environments enough to understand how these things work. And so actually it's going to be these people who are familiar with things like Second Life or familiar with, you know, playing a World of Warcraft type game, who understand the economies and the econometrics of virtual environments, who will have a fundamental advantage in VR social environments. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one, Kim.
Yeah, wow. So I find it's interesting because I'm going through this right now with my mother. And in the simpler context, it's not even just in VR, it's in technology in general, because I work on a computer all day and I use social media constantly. I'm constantly keeping up with how it flows and organically builds, and the rules, the regulations, the unsaid things. You know, you shouldn't click on that button, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. My mother doesn't understand that because she came from a generation that has had to learn it very later on. And everything that I say, oh my God, why'd you do that? She doesn't see it. So I find learning off of how my mom engages with the internet, teaching her how to use email, Skype, don't answer that email, that is the same way I would address bringing the younger generation into it, because they will learn quite quickly. They will surpass us in a way and create their own dialogue, and we'll have to catch up with them. But it's just this really interesting thing. I think it just naturally happens. It's just something that we have to adapt with, build with, take the knowledge that we understand, show it to the younger generation so they understand the rules, and they'll create their own rules. And then we have to, it's really a massive organic process. It's the best way I can describe it, the way I see it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. I'm curious, Sarah, whether or not you think that that's something that there is quite an organic process, or whether you think that there's going to be some benefits to providing some infrastructure and taking learnings from existing environments like Second Life or World of Warcraft or whatever the virtual MMO kind of environments might be, so that we can kind of short circuit and circumnavigate some of the lengthy process of learning how to socially engage in the hierarchies of these social environments.
Yeah, I think there's so much learning to be done with immersive technologies, and I try and do a lot around immersive theatre and understand how stories are told in that space, and kind of the collective communities that form on gaming and in kind of transmedia culture and all those areas. There is so much to learn from. I think what's really important when it comes to kind of the education stuff is that it's not all the gaming side of things, and when you root something in an experience and learning in a much more immersive way, although there are kind of elements of games and being technologically aware, it's not always focused on that. And I mean, my 4 and 7 months she is now, and she insists on saying 4 and 7 months all the time. She she loves it. I was trying to set up a new rift on a new machine earlier, and she knows all about this. She knows what it does. She gets it all. She walks around in her Curoscope t-shirt, which is an adult size, so it really doesn't fit her. But she loves that. She's got her own headset. She knows what the world of opportunity is through this technology. That's not to say she doesn't love picking up a book and reading Cinderella or whatever nonsense she's reading in that form. But she gets to understand the body with the Curoscope t-shirt. She chases dinosaurs, and if I'm traveling, she goes to all of these places virtually, and she gets what it is. But I think it is really important to kind of, kids aren't in headsets all day, every day. Some weeks, it'll be a couple of weeks since she's put on a headset last. It's not always something that she's doing. She is only 4, so I wouldn't expect her to be doing it all the time.
But you say that. You say that, and the thing is that actually that attitude right there is the one that we need to apply to everybody, not just 4-year-olds. It's the fact that the reality of the situation is we're not all going to be walking around permanently with a HMD on. We're not all permanently going to be in virtual environments. But I think there are a lot of people in, these industry and peripheral industries that kind of assume that it will be the be all and the end all of everybody's lives. You're all going to be permanently on these machines. It's like, I don't actually think that's necessarily the way it's going to work.
No, and I think still one of the challenges that I find at the moment is, I work 50% of my time completely in this space. Everyone thinks that I have a headset stuck to my face all the time and I'm always somewhere virtually. And that's not the case. I might be stitching something or editing something or developing a new story that I want to tell. I still have to make the time to sit down, to put on a headset, to watch everything that's being produced. And it is still that appointment of view because, I can have a look at things on my phone, but it's not as immersive. It's not the same. It's not the same experience that I'm after. So I do still have to make that time. And at the moment, it is still limited. It's got that kind of appointment to view TV before we had catch up and on demand. You've got to clear that space and that time and put on the headset and really become immersed to appreciate what's out there. And you've got to do that as a content creator. You've got to do that. You've got to be aware of what's being done. But I certainly don't have a headset on all the time. I used to have one of those phone cases, the Figment VR. There was on a Kickstarter where it was an iPhone case and you switched the button and the back of the phone case turned into a headset and it was absolutely amazing, but my phone broke and I had to get a new one. So that was really cool because I could effectively watch VR all the time, but it's not the same experience as actually being in a proper headset. So
not at all.
Yeah, so I think there are certainly challenges to that as well.
Okay. Well, as always, we like to ask our guests what we think is going to be that most significant change that needs to occur in the next 5 to 10 years, whether that's a cultural shift or a technological shift. But what is it that's really going to shift the way that you're doing business right now? And I'm curious to hear from you, Sarah, what you think that thing is going to be that's going to completely change the way that right now you're doing things.
Okay, I've done kind of technological things before, but I'm going to go with a cultural thing now, kind of based on what I just said and something that Ben said earlier, which I've been thinking about a lot. And there was some research done last year by Deloitte, and it was in their VR report, where they basically said one of the biggest challenges is that people hate putting things on their head. They hate putting things on their faces. So when we get to a point, as Ben said before, when you don't need that, when we can have a look at immersive environments in a different way, I think that'll be really interesting. And I have reservations about that because I personally like to stick on a headset and not be bothered by anyone. I like that feeling that I am 100% committed to that environment and I'm not on my phone at the same time and I'm not on an iPad looking at something else whilst watching the TV or watching a film. So I quite like being completely immersed in an environment. But for everyone to really buy into this, there needs to be that cultural shift where people kind of accept that we're seeing things in a different way, and whether we get rid of a headset or it's a different kind of form, or whether glasses suddenly become cool again, I don't know what it is, but there's certainly something with that restriction and the fact that people don't like putting things on their head that needs to change.
It's very, very true. It's interesting though, because the theme park industry has been kind of, dabbling in this in terms of the out-of-home industry, and digital out-of-home industry have been dabbling in this for quite some time. And certainly they have created those those shared environments that are, you know, fully immersive without the need for a HMD up close. But that, you know, if we look at things like the bus to Mars, you know, these types of environments do already exist. I think it's more a case of, though, how quickly they're going to be adopted. So I'm curious, therefore, to hear from you, Ben, on what you think is going to be that significant shift.
I think, well, when you asked me the question, the first thing that came to my mind is actually more, rather than a shift, maybe getting something back that we've perhaps lost or are losing. And I'm not necessarily talking about something that's affecting my business, you know, directly and uniquely. I'm talking about something that's affecting my life and therefore affecting my business. And I think it's probably affecting other people's as well. And that's trust. I'm really worried. I'm seeing a lot of business, a lot of employees having to act, having to work, having to operate in an environment where they're not necessarily being trusted to make their own decisions and really kind of problem solve in an organic, natural way. And essentially what it means, I'll give you an example. Getting a mortgage or getting any kind of loan or something like that at the moment is very much a case of we need to tick these boxes or it's not happening. And boxes are kind of, they don't make sense. You need like a utility bill. Oh God, utility bills, right? They're a nightmare because they're just something that pops through the post. But apparently it's like the be all and end all of qualification as a document. And no one's really necessarily in those environments able to go, you know what, you're fine. We know this will make sense. We'll just go through with it. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that the financial industry should just be a bit more relaxed. In fact, I'd say the opposite. But it's just more of a case that I worry that people can't act on their own instincts within business. And that helps with sign-off as well. So when we're talking about, you know, things up the chain or internally within people's businesses, I worry that everyone has to have everything signed off in specific hierarchies, and it creates sort of a procrastination internally. And it's not in anyone's mind, it's as a group of people. And I think that would be a big cultural shift, is to kind of loosen things up a little bit.
Okay.
Have less meetings about meetings.
Oh, the good old meeting conundrum. But I am curious then to hear your thoughts on things like the new Amazon Go system that they're talking about introducing, which does feel, although it feels like you're getting more trust, obviously you're still not getting trust because they are tracking absolutely everything. But it does feel like the consumer has more trust in that relationship, and in as much as there's no checkout, you don't have to stand in a queue and, you know, have all your items scanned and then pay your bill. You just kind of go in, you pick up the things you want and you walk out, and job done. And that's kind of beginning to open up that relationship of trust with the brand and the consumer, do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think as I've criticised kind of other areas, I can see it's sort of like as one, you know, part of the forest is burning, the other side is actually growing exponentially faster, often in small areas. And it's like, that's quite an interesting natural path, because we can often get a lot of oppression, and from that oppression something really interestingly free jumps from it. And then actually that takes over and wins, and then everyone goes, actually that's a much better idea, let's go down that route. Let's, for example, offer a lot more trust. I mean, touch contactless for a lot of people when it first came out was terrifying. Actually use it, we trust it a lot. I'm using my phone recently and it's really cool.
Do you know, I actually have been using contactless for so long, I forgot my PIN number.
Yeah, I can easily see that happening.
Okay. So, Kim, what about you? What do you think are the significant things that need to kind of shift in order to change the way that you do business?
You know what, for me, because it's more content creation, it's time. I find technology is moving so fast. Before we used to do phone calls and through the mail, and you have to meet face to face, and with the internet and everything's sped up, and everyone's expecting things done in 2 days to 2 hours to 2 minutes, but our minds still work at the same paces. So it's still allowing time and chances for people to fail and think, and not expecting every idea that comes out of someone's mouth to be this mind-blowing thing. So everyone's allowed to have conversations and slowly bring things together. I think that'd be nice to have that to happen, ideally, but things keep wanting to go faster and faster and faster, which is it can be quite scary, to be honest.
It does cause the potential risk of missing good opportunities and good ideas because you are rushing to get to that end goal. And so I do think that time would be a valuable commodity to be able to get back. So, Nick, in closing, what would be the thing that you think needs to significantly change, be that cultural or technological, in order to do what you do?
Well, the issue of trust is one which comes up in education as well, because we're still in a situation in this country where the majority of schools outright ban students from bringing their mobile phones even into school. And the only way they're going to access a lot of this new emerging technology is if that shifts. So there's an element of trust there. But that comes from teacher education, because there is nowhere which is actually teaching teachers how to integrate this technology into the classroom. And I've done a few sessions with different teachers around the place trying to show them the potential of this, but I'm just one person in a very large pool of teachers in this country, and I think that is a really key part of actually shifting that culture of actually what is possible in the classroom has to come from teacher education, and it's a really difficult thing because the universities which are training the teachers or the schools direct programs which are training the teachers just don't have that knowledge either. So you've got a technology which is racing ahead, and sort of the people who could make really good use of that are nowhere near. They're not even on the same journey, and that's something which is a huge shift which needs to change. And then there are also technological issues in terms of a lot of schools don't have the Wi-Fi infrastructure to be able to support showing detailed 360 films or virtual reality content. To jam up the Wi-Fi, and it won't be so immersive. It will be buffering all the time. And so there's significant challenges in education in this country in making the most of the technology that's developing.
But an interesting opportunity for any of our listeners who are thinking about getting into education and VR and the possibilities there. So definitely an interesting opportunity to build some infrastructure. And I think that would probably apply not just in education, but in many other areas as well, where there is that fundamental education of the trainer training the trainer scenario, where there really is an opportunity to educate and to facilitate in a much more meaningful way. But what I want to do, as always, we ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to, follow you, and we'd like to get you to share with us what your preferred social media handle is. Would you start us off, Sarah?
I'm always on Twitter, living in a virtual world, and my Twitter handle is @virtualsarahj.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ben, why don't you share with us your social media handle of choice?
Yeah, also Twitter. I tend to use that as a nice way of communicating and conversating with people rather than sort of telling you the temperature of my coffee. But that is my Twitter handle is Ben that 3D kid.
Okay.
2 D's on kid.
Say that again, sorry.
It's two D's on the kid. KIDD.
Okay, thank you. And Kim, what about you? What's your social media handle of choice?
My social media is also Twitter, so it's @Kim MAJKUT. I always have to spell that out because no one can pronounce it.
Wonderful, thank you. And Nick, what's your social media handle of choice?
So again, Twitter, and I can be found there as @nfordteacher.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter @DigitalJamLTD.
digitaljamsessions.com